Hi, my name is Riada Ashimovic-Akil. This is Wider Angle Podcast. My today's guest is Edward E. Curtis IV, a publicly engaged scholar of Muslim American, African American, and Arab American history and life, an author of no less than 13 books, if I'm not wrong, and numerous scholarly articles. His most recent works include Muslims of the Heartland, How Syrian Immigrants Made a Home in the American Midwest, and Arab Indianapolis. Dr. Curtis is William M. and Gail M. Platter Chair of the Liberal Arts and Professor of Religious Studies at Indiana University School of Liberal Arts. Hello, Edward, and welcome.
Hello, Rihanna. Nice to see you.
Sure. Thank you so much for coming to Wider Angle. Let's get started. You are the author of numerous books on Islam in America, Muslim American politics, and African diaspora as well. Your earlier book is about Arab Americans in Greater Indianapolis and how they have made impact in that region since the 1800s. So while reading your academic CV, so to speak, I've seen obviously a pattern through your scholarship about themes that you've addressed. But I'm also curious about almost the progression or evolution of these scholarly writings in terms of this latest book. Is it more personal than your other scholarly work? Because you do started, it was a question that resonated, albeit in a different geographical context, about what are you? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Absolutely. Yes. So as a youth, I was always asked, "What are you?" And in rural Southern Illinois, where I grew up, that question generally referred to the question of what race are you? Because I had darker skin, but I didn't have a foreign accent. So no one thought everyone knew I was from Southern Illinois. So you were generally either black or white, and nobody could figure out whether I was black or whether I was white. And that I grew up with that awareness, and it was my Arab grandmother who provided what became the most convincing answer for me to that question. She said, you're an Arab. You're Syrian, you're Lebanese." And as I write in the book, if I asked her, "Well, Granny, what's the difference between Syrian and Lebanese?" And she would say, "Oh, honey, they're all the same." Now, a lot of people today would rightly scoff at that answer, but for my grandmother from Southern Illinois, she really did see the identity of what today are Jordanian, Palestinian, Syrians, and Lebanese as part of Bilad al-Shem, or the Greater Syria, and saw a lot of similarities. So I grew up with that history, but it's not the history that I first became an expert on. There was another story going on in rural Southern Illinois, and that was the story of racialization and the extent to which I could not see my Arabness through. I only saw my Arabness through my grandmother. There weren't other Arabs around. There was no one with whom to talk. Very few, and at least people who would admit to being Arab. And so it was actually, I remember in fourth grade reading my first long book, and it was a book about Black history. And it was through Black history that I came to understand what was happening to me and other people of color. Even though I do not self-identify as Black, that was the sort of Rosetta Stone. The Black literature and Black history, which I began reading in fourth grade, really became a way of understanding race in America and how I fit into racial typographies and realities. And so at that point, I really started to focus on Black American history, and it was a passion of mine throughout high school. Then when I got to college, I switched to focusing on Islamic studies. And in graduate school, I combined my two loves, and I studied both Black studies and Islamic studies so that I could understand why African Americans had converted to Islam in significant numbers, and how African American Islam had been important to the story of the United States and the world. And that's really what that was the expertise that I developed as a graduate student, and much of my work, or most of my work, has been about that. And only recently did I turn to Arab American studies, as I came to want to know much more about, really the history of, my own ethnic group in the United States, and in particular in my home region, the Midwest.
Mm. And you do give lovely descriptions of both your grandmother, the relationship with her, and the sort of knowledge that she has transferred to you about your family and the community, which we will talk about in our conversation. So this book, in various reviews, one of them, which I read, for example, in Kirkus Review, was described as, quote, a fresh portrayal of American history and identity, end of quote. And so I'm curious to learn, what did you pay special attention to while researching for this book? Or what are the connections that you kind of wanted to emphasize to your readers about these Arabic speaking Christian and Muslim Midwesterners? And which
Yeah, the book
period did you focus on?
Yeah, the book focuses on Arabic-speaking Muslims, and in my other work, I've done more on Arabic-speaking Christians. But
Mhm.
the
Obviously, Muslims in the heartland, right?
right, absolutely. But I do mention,
Mhm.
because they were really sharing the same spaces. I mean,
Mhm.
first of all, they were this is a relatively small group compared to the
Mhm.
rest of the population, and they could speak Arabic with one another,
Mhm.
and they did business with one another,
Mhm.
and they socialized with one another. If they were in favor of Arab nationalist liberation and independence, they did politics with one another.
Mhm.
Everywhere from Cedar Rapids to South Bend, Indiana, all across what today is the Midwest. So I think, I think it's fair to say,
Mhm.
I have heard this in the last 15 or 20 years. I have heard, around the dinner table, not my own dinner table, but in party talk, let's say, the idea that the diversity of America, especially in the Midwest, is new. And of course, there are many new arrivals of Asian, African, European, and Latin American people, for sure, these particular people. But these are not the first African, Asian, and Latin American people to be in rural America. In fact, there never was a rural America without these. And so one of the
Mhm.
things I wanted to do was I wanted to place Arabic speaking Muslims inside of the most quintessential themes of American and Midwestern history, and some of the most important institutions, like the local public school, the dance hall, the factory, the US military, all of these institutions which are associated with the mainstream of American life, especially in the late 1800s to World War II. I wanted to retell the story of this place, the Midwest, and of America through the eyes of its Arab American Muslims.
Hmm. And of course, we're speaking about people, I mean, at least 500,000 people who came from Ottoman Syria, right? I mean, in these waves of mass migration.
That's right. From the late 1800s until about 1920, perhaps one out of every five greater Syrians left Syria, about 500,000 people. Around 100,000 came to the United States, 100,000 to Brazil, 100,000 to Argentina, and the other 200,000 in all the other countries in the Americas. And thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, settled in the Midwest. And
Mm.
those are the stories that I focused on. And it was very important to me, while placing them in the dance hall, or at the local religious congregation, or at the
Mhm.
grocery store, or at the town square, to be very, very detailed about
Mhm.
their lives, so that I wanted the reader to be able to see what they saw, to feel what they felt as
Right.
much as possible, to even smell what they smelled.
Mhm.
That was the idea, to really recapture what Arab American Muslim life was from 1890 to through World War II.
That's so interesting. So, considering the variety of destinations where these migrants left, so what then specifically made these tens of thousands of people attracted to U.S. Midwest, the region where they stayed, including, of course, the generations of their offspring too.
Yes, this may be surprising to some of your viewers because you generally associate Detroit, of course, with Arab Americans, but then so many more immigrants after 1965 were going, to New York, and more recently among Arab Americans, California, Texas, and Florida have been very, very popular destinations for Arab Americans or for Arab immigrants. But the reason why they came to the Midwest from 1890 through World War I was because the Midwest was the economic powerhouse of this country at the time. And it was symbolized in the Columbian Exposition or the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Chicago was in many ways, the most important hub in this Midwestern society that brought together an agricultural revolution with an industrial revolution. The seizing of Native American lands and turning that towards intensive agriculture, the creation of the refrigerated train, railroad car, which allowed them to pack meats, to slaughter and then pack meats and send them along the many railways that had been built at the time. That went along with the incredible building of both railroad and later automobile factories and other factories along the Great Lakes in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And those came together to produce unprecedented opportunity for people, not just from the Eastern Mediterranean, but from across Southern and Eastern Europe as well.
And the listeners cannot see very interesting background that you have, which is actually the cover of the book. I read the electronic version, but it's almost really a map of the region, which gives an idea of how vast it is, and not just the usual maybe hubs that one might think of in general, right? So can you tell us a little bit? You did address it in terms of these human interactions that you covered throughout the stories of various families and people in your book. So can you expand a little bit about what you think when you write that the Midwest was, as you write, a human geography, not a natural one? And you say it was a human history rather than natural history that forged this region.
Yes, so the Midwest is, topographically, it includes the short grass prairies of the Western Dakotas with deeply forested areas of Indiana and the Great Lakes, and then the very, hot regions of Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, all along the Ohio River there into Ohio. I mean, these physical features don't look like each other. The North Woods of Wisconsin is very different than those short grass prairies of the Western North. But that it was a region that was forged through settlement. The rivers, and then the railroads, and then the roads were all important to that. But just as important were the people who settled in these places, and then they developed social, ethnic, religious, and racial networks in which they would, if you will, plant and grow their cultures of various kinds, and in this case, American, Arab, and Muslim, all over this region. And it was in their marriages across state lines, their travel to see the opening of a mosque or the burial of someone who was honored in the community, or the marriage of someone else. All of that forged this Midwestern identity for all ethnic groups, but Arab American Muslims, looking at them, focusing on them, shows just how much the region worked as that kind of human geography, how it was more than just some disconnected towns. It actually was connected by the people who lived there.
Which leads me perfectly to the next question. While I was also reading your book, I mean, it was interesting how, and you've touched upon this idea that Syrian Muslims were, as you wrote, ordinary Midwesterners, and you've described whether it was in the school, etc., in terms of public life, and you wrote about the importance of the ethnic religious congregation in that sense. So in terms of their collective life. But then we get to, I don't know, tricky part or actually part of life, which is that you also say that that congregation was part of the assimilation process or a factor. So can you tell us a little bit about that part of assimilation of this immigrant community, which is, I mean, not that any different with some other communities that migrated to this country as well, right? That's a story in itself,
Absolutely.
but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a
Mm,
common. So the image sometimes of immigration from this period of the late 1800s and the early 1900s was an image of the melting pot.
mhm,
All of these ethnic particulars melting away into one big Americanness. And oftentimes, I mean, the way in which we use that word assimilation,
mhm,
just in common everyday English, oftentimes implies that there's a disappearance of particularity.
mhm,
Um, and it turns out that that's not how assimilation occurs in the Midwest. Instead, in order to become assimilated to the Midwest and to America, most people develop their own ethnic religious congregation
mhm,
in order to participate in society. So if you look at assimilation as the ability to participate in a given society, in its nonprofit world, in its education, in its culture, in its economy, each ethnic religious group tended to have some kind of base which allowed them the power to participate, which gave them the networks to participate.
mhm,
I mean, the establishment of successful peddling and then grocery stores among the Arab American Muslims is a perfect example.
mhm,
The Syrian Corner Grocery is an institution across the Midwest in the first half of the 20th century. But that institution doesn't occur without intra-ethnic cooperation,
mhm,
because you got to find the capital, you need help, right, to do this. So what we need to see is whether we're talking about Ashkenazi or Sephardi Jews, um, holiness Christians from Scandinavia, German Lutherans, Polish or Italian Catholics, we find that the ethnic religious congregation, local congregation, is a form. Yes, on the one hand, it preserves a certain kind of particularity, reinterpreted for the American milieu, because after all, men and women in Syria and Lebanon don't tend to spend that much time at one single mosque.
mhm,
I mean, the men might go there, right, from there to pray on Fridays, but that, unless they're really religious or studying with a sheikh or something, they're not going to be there. But in this case, it becomes a whole community center.
mhm,
And each ethnic religious group has that little community center that allows it, that
mhm.
encourages it to participate in the greater society. That's how you assimilate, not by getting rid of all your difference, but by strategically um, building a community, ethnic community, communal institutions which allow you to do so.
Hmm. I guess then that means that maybe that's the part or the agency of the community, but there is also the external forces, so to speak, or the larger racial politics of the United States that you've mentioned in your book as well, in terms of, well, the fact that Syrian Muslims were not able to evade or escape as an immigrant group that larger racial politics in some of its negative forms as well throughout the decades, right?
That's right. I mean, there's always social discrimination,
Mhm.
and there's sometimes legal discrimination, but it depends on the time and the place.
And that was very interested. So what do you mean when you say that there were differences in terms of particular towns sometimes in which these people lived as well?
Yeah, I think that one of the scholarly contributions to the book, which is written, by the way, for a broad audience,
Hmm. Yeah.
it's not just written for my fellow academics, but I think that if I'm not mistaken, one of the scholarly contributions is that it really looks at the differences among the different cities and
Mhm.
towns in which Arab American Muslims settled.
Mhm.
So rather than painting one big national picture of anti-Muslim discrimination, we really have a dynamic and complex environment of
Mhm.
discrimination. So, for example,
Mhm.
there's always social discrimination, but legally speaking, in the Dakotas,
Mhm.
Muslims, Syrian Muslims, are classified as members of the white race.
Mhm.
And so they get all of the privileges that members of the white race get. For example, they can become naturalized citizens of the United States. Remember that Asians at this time could not. The Asian Exclusion Acts barred naturalization among Asian people. So even though these Syrians were technically from Asia, they still, for the North Dakota and the South Dakota census and government records, they were counted as white. So they can go get their free land as homesteaders. And the reason why they need to have that, the reason why that white racial identity is important is in order to actually take deed to the land, you have to be eligible for naturalized citizenship. So that gives them this kind of white racial privilege. That's a privilege that they don't have in Michigan City, Indiana, where they're literally at 1900, the same year that Syrian Muslims are claiming homesteads in the Western Dakotas. They can't even go to the beach. They're banned from the
Mhm.
beach because they're seen as people of color, dangerous,
Mhm.
potentially scandalous for the white ladies on the beach. So they're treated as people of color in Michigan City until after World War One. In Cedar Rapids, at the same time, very different story. They have much more success. And one of the reasons I explain that is because there's no one dominant ethnic group in Cedar Rapids. And the public face of the Czech and Slovak, or what was called Bohemian culture, is
Mhm.
uh, it is so explicit. I mean, when you walk down the street, you see Czech epigraphy on the buildings. You can go take your Czech language class. You can go have your Czech dances. You can go to the Sokolovna gymnasium. It's so explicit that I think that makes room for non-Anglo culture within the tapestry and the white ethnic tapestry of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So those are some of the factors, and as a result, they get a lot of legal support for their
Mhm.
citizenship and for their rights. These Syrian Muslims do from white male leaders in Cedar Rapids.
That's so fascinating that it could have varied just by a town. And you do describe in the book throughout the decades, in the 20s with the rebirth of the Klux Klan, then in 1950s, of course, what happens after 1970s and the OPEC oil embargo as well. And then, of course, you talk and explain about these different waves of anti-Muslim prejudice in some way that has changed throughout the decades, often depending on the US foreign policy, right? As you tell us. And of course, we come to 9/11, after which you write that everything became, quote, much, much worse in wake of 9/11. Can you tell us a little bit, both from your research or even personally, if you'd like to share more?
Well, I think most recently, in the past several years, we've seen since the election year for Donald Trump, 2016, we've seen an increase in the amount of airtime that white supremacists, I mean, explicitly white supremacists are the airtime that they get and the kind of way in which they are very comfortable in the public square. I mean, the bullying, it was always there, but it's in public. It's sort of in our face more than it ever
More
has been.
mainstream?
Yeah.
Mm.
And so that, and many of those white supremacists are not only anti-Black, anti-Jewish, and anti-trans, they're also anti-Muslim.
Mhm.
It's part of a toxic stew of white supremacy. And so these groups have found a refuge in some of the rural parts of the Midwest, even though they are national. And I mean, it's from New England to California. But in the region from which I come, the region that I call home, the region where I grew up, it's very hard to see these groups. It's very painful to see these groups. And so, in many ways, the story that I'm telling confronts the version of history that they're trying to peddle. And that version is one that erases the Black, brown, and white contributions and Native contributions to making the Midwest what it is today. It tells a false narrative, one that was perpetuated by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, that it was only white people who had made us who we are. It was only them, this sort of stereotypical. And it's interesting, especially for people on the coasts. I feel like the East and the West Coast, sometimes they perpetuate this idea that somehow the Midwest is this white bread, bleached out country where there is no diversity. No, I say to my East and West Coast brothers, we're here and we've always been here. Don't believe the stereotypes of these white supremacists. So I'm adding a narrative to try to fuel a different kind of imagination that takes away the past from this kind of idealized white past from white supremacists and gives it back to its rightful owners, which is all of us who have made this place what it is today. So that's the larger political context of why I'm writing the story I'm writing. Because it's one thing to say that Black and brown people, are part of Chicago or New York. Everybody said, oh, of course, because part of the racist narrative was that, Black people live in the city. But it's another thing to say in the very heart of rural America, there were Arab American Muslims in 1900 praying, reading the Quran, and proudly passing on their identity to their children.
And you have a documentary, Arab Americans or Arab Indianapolis as well. I think, is it available on PBS? Is it playing there? Has it played there? What is that? Is that based on the book that carries the same name?
Yeah, in Arab Indianapolis, it's actually based on all of the community history that 9 of my students and 24 of my fellow community members have documented over the last several years. It started out just as a blog. And then it became both at the same time a movie and a book, because the community was deeply in support. And my university, Indiana University and IUPUI, have both been given a lot of support to this project. And it tells the story of how Arabic-speaking people settled in the 1880s here in Indianapolis, and then charts our contributions since then to the public culture, to medicine, to religion, to military service, to all these these public parts of a typically Indianapolis identity.
And is it available to be seen? Actually, it is on YouTube, right? Or on your website,
Yeah,
if I
you
recall
can
well.
screen it at PBS, screen it at WFYI, screen it on ArabIndianapolis.com. The website for Arab Indianapolis is ArabIndianapolis.com.
So, Edward, we at New Lines Magazine have recently published an essay entitled Many Arab Americans Fight to Be Counted Differently by Anna Lekas Miller, in which she describes how some, at least activists, worry that Arab Americans as a community who are currently classified in the census as white are politically marginalized. And in that essay, she describes the experience of Mexicans who were also, quote unquote, white until 1970. So I was wondering if you could share any thoughts about it, considering that you're a frequent commentator on issues related to politics and Muslims in the US.
Yes, and whether we win it or not with the federal government, the important thing is to try to win it among ourselves, because there are still Arab Americans who hold on to the idea that they are white. And I know, and this has been a very harmful ideology in our community, where in particular, oftentimes it's our mothers and sisters and female friends who bear the brunt of this devotion to whiteness, because it literally, we have people literally changing their bodies, bleaching their skin in order to be attractive and to fit into a white American narrative. And that colorism among us is so deeply painful for all of us who have grown up around it and with it. So whether or not we win the fight to be included in the U.S. Census as Middle Easterners, North Africans, the MENA category, we can use that fight in part to battle white supremacy and anti-Blackness in our own communities, because we are Black, brown, and white. We are a multiracial community. The Arab Americans are. So, and that's as important as anything, because if we won't be for each other, then who will be for us? We need to support one another across and rid ourselves of this colorism and focus in. And one of the reasons we're counted as white is because that's what our elders wanted. In 1909, as I explained in the book, after the Secretary of, I think it was Labor and Commerce, told all the local judges and even sent out federal marshals and said, stop naturalizing these Syrians. Stop giving them citizenship. They're not white. They're Asian, and so they're not eligible. And we see in the book how so many Midwesterners, not just Syrians, but non-Syrians, fought back against that. But it was so important that, just like the NAACP, Arab Americans committed tremendous economic resources to fighting this designation in the courts. And in 1915, they got a precedent, the Dow case, D-O-W, in which case a federal court decided that indeed Syrians were white and thus eligible for citizenship. So it is the legacy in part, not just of racialism, but our participation in this racialization that we're suffering. And so again, it's that, let's go back to our own role in this as well as we fight for this Middle East, North Africa category. So that's one thing. And two, it's just very practically needed, because the particular challenges faced by Middle Eastern and North Africans in terms of discrimination and prejudice, and not only Muslims, by the way. Remember, half of Arabs in this country or more are Christian, not Muslim, right? Half. And so it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter to the bigot who just sees you as Arab and thinks automatically assigns you as a Muslim. As we know, many of the hate crimes perpetuated against so-called Muslims have actually victimized Christians, Sikhs, and Hindus, anyone who quote unquote looks Muslim. And so we need to track that much more carefully. And we also need in our community a much better chance of studying our public health. And the only way to do that is to be able to disaggregate data on the census and understand what's happening to us. So it'll be so useful as we try to contribute to the betterment of our community if we know more. And if the federal government knows more. So there are all kinds of reasons why that would be a fantastic, in my view, a fantastic change if it does occur.
Yeah, well, certainly it's an ongoing conversation in that very diverse community as well. And I recommend everybody to read both your book and Anna's fascinating essay. And as we kind of come towards the end of our conversation, you did address a little bit what I call, obviously, the wider angle of this whole research, of this whole story. What can these stories help us with, considering particularly both, as you mentioned, the increasing polarization, mainstreaming of hate throughout the past several years, if we can speak in those terms. What does the depiction of this one immigrant community say, and where does it stand within the grand puzzle of American and Midwestern history?
Well, in order to tell you the wider angle, I'm going to go back to my own biography, my own particular story. And because you mentioned as well earlier in our talk that this was a very personal story, and something happened to me during the writing of this book, and I don't know if this can be helpful to others or
Mhm.
not,
Mhm.
but I hope so. And what happened to me was, and I'm not a spring chicken. I mean, but after all these decades, it really did change as I came to know the story of our of these Arab ancestors. Um, I began to rethink my own feeling of belonging to the place that I call home, to the place where I was raised, because I thought that my brown skin and my people were a foreign intervention in a essentially white land. And I can understand why, given how I was treated as a young person and the subtle messages oftentimes that I got, and sometimes not so subtle, that I didn't belong, but especially that haunting question, what are you?
Mm.
I can understand how it was that I got that feeling that I was somehow I didn't belong. But after doing the research and writing this book, after visiting the graves of our ancestors in Cedar Rapids and traveling around from place to place and going from archive to archive and looking at photographic evidence and the census data and the World War I draft cards and the newspaper articles and this mountain of evidence that I sifted through in order to write this book, I felt it's more than just I knew it in my head. I felt deeply in my bones
Mhm.
how much my people had made the place in which I was raised, how much we belong to it as much as anybody else.
Mm.
And that was a very powerful antidote to the kind of anti-Arab and other forms of racism that we as a community might face. And I think for any community feeling out of place, for any feeling really taking, it's hard to withstand that racism. And we know from the latest ISPU poll that internalized Islamophobia has gone up in the Muslim American community, and especially among youth. And one of the ways to fight that, it seems to me, is to not just look at our present differently, but to look at our past differently. And to see the past not just as a story of failure or as defeat, but also to look at those moments of resilience and triumph. And that's what I hope in many ways that this story does, is to truly is to deeply acknowledge the long history of Arabs and Muslims in the Midwest, and in so doing, give us strength for a journey that is at this moment very hard.
Thank you for this genuine, candid conversation and answer, both about your personal insights, experiences, and scholarly inputs. Everybody can read your book, and watch your documentary, which is available both on your website, and you are on Twitter and I'm sure on other social media. So those who are interested can.
I'm a Twitter monogamist, actually.
Well, lucky you. Sometimes those digital detoxes are very healthy. So to everybody else, thank you, Edward, once again. It was such a pleasure having you on. And to all of you, stay tuned for more. Have a good day. Bye.